A billionaire CEO, a sabotage Porsche worth $500,000, and a quiet single father from a small garage nobody had ever heard of, who discovered a conspiracy that was about to destroy everything she built. What happened when Logan Carter popped open that engine bay changed both their lives forever. Not because he was special, not because he was lucky, but because he saw something nobody else was supposed to see. And someone was willing to threaten a 7-year-old girl to keep him quiet. If you want to know how far one man's silence can be bought, keep watching. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Hit like, and let's begin. The morning Logan Carter's life changed, he was lying on his back underneath a 2019 BMW 5 Series with a cracked exhaust manifold and grease in his hair, listening to a classic rock station that kept cutting out every time a truck passed on the road outside. It was a Tuesday in September. The kind of morning that smells like damp leaves and motor oil, when the Connecticut sky hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be overcast or just threatening. Logan had been at the garage since 6:30, before Emma's school bus arrived, before his one part-time assistant Marcus showed up at 8, before any of the daily noise started. He liked those quiet hours. They were the only ones that belonged entirely to him. The garage, Carter Automotive, a name he'd painted himself on a plywood sign 10 years ago, sat on a stretch of road in Stamford that wasn't exactly thriving. There was a closed dry cleaner next door and a Vietnamese sandwich shop on the corner that only opened 3 days a week. The neighborhood wasn't bad. It just wasn't anything. It existed between things. Logan had spent most of his adult life in spaces that felt exactly like that, between what was and what was supposed to be. He heard his phone buzz against the concrete floor before he felt it. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He pulled himself out from under the BMW with one arm, the creeper rolling on uneven floor tiles, and picked up the phone with fingers he didn't bother wiping clean. Unknown number. Connecticut area code. Greenwich, if the prefix meant anything. He almost let it go to voicemail. Carter Automotive, he said. A woman's voice came through, and the first thing he noticed about it wasn't that it was authoritative. It was that it was tired. The kind of tired that lives underneath composure, visible only at certain angles. Is this Logan Carter, the owner? Speaking. My name is Victoria Hale. I was given your number by Richard Fontaine at Bavarian Imports in Darien. He said, a pause, brief but noticeable. He said you might be the only person in the state who could help me with something unusual. Logan sat up and rested his forearm across his knee. He knew Richard Fontaine. He'd done him a favor 2 winters ago. A misfiring injector on a rare E30 M3 that 3 other shops had misdiagnosed. Richard had been grateful in the way that wealthy men are occasionally grateful, quietly but usefully. What kind of car? Logan asked. A 1973 Porsche 911S. Matching numbers? Or it was supposed to be matching numbers. Another pause. Something is wrong with it, and I can't get a straight answer from anyone. Logan leaned back against the BMW's rear tire. Where are you located? Greenwich. I can send a car for you or arrange a flatbed for the Porsche, whichever. I'll drive myself, he said. Tomorrow morning work? Today would be better, if that's possible. He looked around the garage. The BMW needed 2 more hours. There was a Volvo coming in at 2 o'clock for an inspection. Marcus could handle the Volvo. I can be there by 1, he said. He heard her exhale, just slightly. Thank you, Mr. Carter. I'll text you the address. He hung up and stared at the phone for a moment. Then he went back under the BMW, because the exhaust manifold didn't care about Greenwich. He told Emma about the job over breakfast the next morning. It had taken him until after dinner the night before to rearrange his schedule and square things with Marcus. Emma was 7, and she ate her cereal with the focused intensity of someone who had been told repeatedly not to splash milk on her school uniform. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's particular way of tilting her head when she was thinking about something she didn't intend to say out loud. Is it a fancy car? She asked. Pretty fancy, old Porsche. What's wrong with it? Don't know yet. She considered this. What if you can't fix it? Then I can't fix it, he said. And I tell her that, and I go home. Emma seemed to accept this as a reasonable philosophy. She went back to her cereal. Logan drove her to the bus stop at 7:45 and watched until the yellow bus took the corner. It was a thing he did every morning, a small, unremarkable gesture, but it was the kind of thing that becomes part of your architecture after a while, the routine actions that hold the structure of a day together. He didn't think about it consciously. He just stood there until the bus disappeared. Then he went back inside to shower, change into a clean shirt, and find his good set of inspection tools. The Hale estate in Greenwich occupied a stretch of property along a private road that didn't appear on Google Maps with any useful detail. The gates were black iron and tall, and when Logan pulled his truck up to the call box, a camera pivoted toward him before he'd said anything. "Logan Carter," he said, "I have an appointment." The gates opened. The driveway was long enough to contain its own weather patterns. On either side, mature oak trees had been landscaped with the kind of precision that requires a full-time crew. The house itself, the main house, appeared from around a curve, a Georgian colonial structure that had been updated sometime in the last decade with the kind of subtle architectural interventions that cost more than most people's homes. Wings extended left and right. A separate garage structure sat slightly behind and to the right of the main house. Logan parked and took a breath. He had been in places like this before, not often, and always in a professional capacity. He had learned over the years to ignore the peripheral details, the art, the furniture, the scale of the rooms, and focus on whatever he'd been brought there to look at. It was a useful skill. A woman in her early 30s came down the front steps as he climbed out of his truck. She was dressed in what looked like business clothes that had been put on that morning with different intentions. Dark pants, a pale blue blouse with one sleeve slightly rolled up, no jewelry except a thin watch. Her hair was dark and pulled back, but not completely. Some of it had escaped and she hadn't fixed it. She looked like someone who had been fighting something for several days and was no longer entirely certain she was winning. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm, not performative. "Victoria Hale. Thank you for coming on short notice." "Sure," he said. "Where's the car?" Something passed across her face. The faint recognition that he was not going to perform the small social rituals of admiring the property or being visibly impressed. She might have found it refreshing, or just strange. "The garage," she said. "This way." The 4-car garage attached to the estate's east wing was climate-controlled, which was the first thing Logan noticed. The second thing he noticed was the lighting. Proper inspection lighting, not just the ambient fixtures you find in a decorative garage. Someone had actually thought about visibility. The Porsche sat in the second bay from the left. Even before he approached it, he felt something shift in his attention, the particular narrowing that happens when you've worked on enough cars to recognize, from 20 feet away, when something is wrong with one. It was visually stunning. That part was undeniable. Guards red, the shade that defines a generation of 911s, and in a condition that suggested either a very recent restoration or extraordinary original care. The chrome was correct. The bumpers were period appropriate. Someone had clearly spent significant money on the cosmetic presentation. But it sat slightly wrong. He couldn't have explained that to someone who hadn't spent 15 years reading cars the way other people read faces. There was a subtle asymmetry in the ride height, barely perceptible, and something else, a kind of stillness about it that wasn't the stillness of a well-preserved vintage car. It was the stillness of something interrupted. 2 people stood near the garage entrance, a man with a tablet and a younger woman who appeared to be taking notes in an actual paper notebook. Both were dressed in that studied neutral way of people who are paid to remain in the background. Victoria made a small gesture in their direction. "My assistant Cora and James from our acquisitions team. They've been managing the documentation on this car. They can give you whatever records you need." Logan nodded at them without stopping. He was already walking toward the Porsche. He circled it once, slowly, hands in his pockets. He crouched at the front left to look at the panel gaps. He stood and looked down the driver's side from above. He checked the VIN plate on the dashboard through the windshield without opening the door. Then he turned to Victoria. "How long have you owned it?" 8 months, she said. "I purchased it through a private sale facilitated by my business partner, Damian Cross. He found it through a contact in Switzerland. The paperwork describes it as a fully authenticated matching numbers car with a documented restoration history." "What did you pay?" A brief hesitation. $480,000. Logan absorbed that number without reacting. Has it been driven since you bought it? Twice. Short distances. It ran poorly both times. We had 3 different shops look at it. 2 in New York, 1 in New Canaan. Nobody could isolate the problem. What did they tell you? Carburation issues? Possible fuel delivery? One of them suggested the ignition timing was off. She crossed her arms, not in a closed-off way, more like she was cold. None of them could fix it, and 2 of them didn't seem entirely sure what they were looking at. Logan looked at the car for another moment. Can I pop the hood? Please, she said. He reached in through the driver's window. The door wasn't locked, and pulled the hood release. Then he walked around to the rear of the car, because this was a 911 and the engine was in the back, and he lifted the rear lid. And then he went still. Not the polite stillness of professional inspection, the involuntary stillness of genuine recognition. He stood there for almost 15 seconds without moving, his eyes moving across the engine components with a kind of controlled urgency, like someone reading a letter they were not expecting and cannot entirely believe. Mr. Carter? Victoria said. He didn't answer immediately. He was looking at a modification on the intake manifold, a specific type of porting work, a particular profile in the machining, a signature in metal that he had seen only once before in his life. Over a decade ago. In a workshop in Stuttgart, standing beside a 70-year-old German engineer named Hans Brecker, who had laughed at him for being slow and then spent 4 hours showing him things about airflow dynamics that Logan had never read in any textbook. The modification was Hans's work, unmistakably. Logan had watched those hands do exactly this, but something was wrong with the way it sat in the engine bay. Mr. Carter, Victoria said again, closer now. What do you see? Logan straightened up slowly and looked at her. I need a couple hours, he said, and I need everyone else out of this garage. The 2 assistants exchanged a glance. Victoria looked at him steadily for a moment, measuring something or deciding something, and then said quietly, Give us a moment. James and Cora disappeared through the side door. Logan turned back to the engine. You can stay, he said, but I need you to not talk for a while. Victoria Hale, founder and CEO of a company that managed over $2 billion in assets, sat down on an overturned milk crate in the corner of her own garage and didn't say a word. He worked for nearly 2 hours. He didn't rush. He never rushed during diagnosis, a lesson that had taken him years to fully internalize. Because the temptation when something is clearly wrong is to find the wrong thing quickly rather than find the right thing carefully. He had made that mistake enough times early in his career that the lesson had real texture to it. He photographed everything before touching it. He kept his phone mounted to a small magnetic stand he carried in his tool bag, and he moved through the engine bay methodically, photographing each component from multiple angles before assessing it. Victoria watched him from the milk crate without speaking. Occasionally her phone vibrated and she silenced it. Once she answered a text, typing quickly and putting the phone face down on her knee. Twice she stood up and walked a slow circle around the garage floor, and both times she came back to the crate without looking directly at what he was doing. He appreciated that. Some people hover, and hovering ruins the kind of focus that diagnosis requires. After 90 minutes, he sat back on his heels and stared at the underside of the car. He had found 7 components. 7 components that, taken individually, would look like normal part variations to anyone without very specific knowledge. A slightly different carburetor jet specification. A fuel pump with modern seals hidden behind original-appearing hardware. An ignition distributor with a subtly updated advance curve. 4 additional components spread throughout the drivetrain and suspension that shared the same characteristic. They were modern parts wearing vintage clothing, and they had been installed with considerable skill. Not dealership skill. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Logan finally stood, planted his feet, and looked at Victoria. She was watching him the way people watch doctors come out of operating rooms. Not panicked, but very, very alert. I need to ask you something direct, he said. All right. When you bought this car, was the purchase handled entirely through Damien Cross, or did you personally verify the authentication documentation? Something changed in her face. Just slightly. Damien managed the acquisition, she said. He has more experience with vintage European cars than I do. I reviewed the documentation, but the provenance verification, the authentication of the matching numbers, that was his process. Logan nodded slowly. The engine in this car, he said, choosing his words with the same care he would use assembling a precision component, was rebuilt by a specific person. I know because I watched that person work years ago. The modification on the intake manifold is something he did by hand. It's like a fingerprint. There are maybe 4 or 5 people in the world who would recognize it. Victoria was very still. Which means this engine is authentic. It's real. It's worth every dollar you paid for it, possibly more. She let out a breath, and he let her have that moment. However, he said, someone has replaced several other components with modern parts. The replacements are deliberate and skillfully done. They would make the car perform poorly, exactly as you've experienced, and more importantly, they would make the car fail any serious technical authentication. A proper inspection would flag this car as a parts replacement vehicle, which would drop the authenticated value dramatically. How dramatically? From the neighborhood of 500,000 to somewhere around 80 or 90, depending on who's buying. The garage was very quiet. Victoria stood up from the milk crate. She didn't look scared. She looked like a woman who had just heard something confirm a fear she had been carrying without naming. "You're saying someone sabotaged this car to devalue it," she said. "That's what the evidence says. Someone who would have needed access to the car after it was purchased." "Yes. And who would need to know enough about vintage Porsche authentication to know exactly which components to change?" "Yes," Logan said again. Victoria turned away from him and walked toward the garage window. She stood there for a long moment with her back to him, looking out at the oak trees on the property's east edge. When she turned around, her expression had settled into something that Logan recognized because he had worn it himself once or twice, the specific composure of someone who has decided not to fall apart, at least not right now, at least not here. "Mr. Carter," she said, "how long would it take you to restore this car properly? To source the correct components and bring it back to full authentication?" He thought about it honestly. 8 to 12 weeks, maybe 10 if the sourcing goes well. Parts like this don't come from AutoZone. She almost smiled at that. Almost. "What would you need from me?" "Access to the documentation, full provenance records, purchase receipts, correspondence related to the acquisition. And I'd want to have a conversation with your attorney if that's possible." She looked at him. "Why an attorney?" "Because what I'm looking at isn't just a car problem," Logan said carefully, "and I don't think you'd want me to pretend it is." Another long silence. Then Victoria Hale nodded. "Come inside," she said. "I'll have coffee made." Oh. He stayed at the estate for 4 hours that first day, in a room off the main house that served as a combination library and secondary office. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, 2 large monitors on a mahogany desk, a leather couch that had the comfortable shabbiness of something actually used. Victoria laid out what she could. The acquisition of the Porsche had been proposed by Damien Cross 9 months earlier, framed as both an investment and a personal gift to Victoria on the 10-year anniversary of Hale Capital's founding. Damien had managed the contact in Switzerland, the authentication process, the transport, the insurance, and the paperwork. Victoria had been shown a portfolio of documentation that she acknowledged. Now she had reviewed superficially. "I trusted him," she said. It wasn't an excuse, it was just a statement of fact, and she said it with the flatness of someone removing a bandage. Logan sat across from her with a legal pad, taking notes in a handwriting that was somewhere between efficient and illegible. "Has anything else felt off?" he asked. "Beyond the car?" "What do you mean?" "Transactions you didn't fully understand. Approvals you were asked to sign quickly. Third parties you weren't introduced to." Victoria looked at him steadily. "Are you asking me to evaluate my entire business partnership based on a tampered carburetor?" "I'm asking you to consider the possibility that the carburetor isn't the main event," Logan said. It wasn't a comfortable thing to say. He knew that. He also knew that comfortable things weren't always the honest ones. She was quiet for a long moment. "There's a property transaction," she said slowly, "from about 4 months ago. A commercial real estate deal in the Bronx. Damien structured it as a distressed asset acquisition. The numbers never quite made sense to me, but Damien explained it. He's very good at explaining things that are complicated in ways that make you feel like you're the one who doesn't understand." Logan wrote that down. I'd like to put you in touch with someone, he said. An attorney I know. Her name is Patricia Owens. She does financial fraud work, and she's done it for a long time. Victoria leaned back. You carry a financial fraud attorney in your contact list? For the first time since he'd arrived, Logan allowed himself something very close to a smile. It didn't quite reach his eyes, but it was real. She's my neighbor, he said. She's lived in the apartment across the hall for 6 years. I fix her car. She told me once to call her if I ever needed her, and I never have. Until now. Until now, he agreed. He drove home through the early September evening with his windows down and the radio off, letting the highway noise fill the cab. He had not said everything he was thinking. He rarely did. There was a discipline to that, knowing which thoughts were useful to say out loud immediately and which ones needed to be held privately until they had more shape. What he had not said to Victoria Hale was this. The moment he had seen Hans Brecker's work in that engine bay, he had felt something move inside him that he hadn't felt in a very long time. It was the sensation of relevance, of being precisely the right person in precisely the right place. He hadn't felt that since before Claire died. He pulled into the lot behind the garage at 7:15, and through the window of the apartment above, he could see the blue flicker of the television. Emma was still up. Marcus must have taken her after school and brought her home. He sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running. He thought about the Porsche, about the 7 components, about the very specific skill required to do what had been done to it. And he thought about the fact that whoever had altered that car had not done it sloppily. They had done it thoughtfully, patiently, with the confidence of someone who didn't expect to be caught. He turned off the engine and went inside. Emma had saved him half her pizza. They ate on the couch with the TV playing something animated that neither of them was really watching, and she told him about a fight on the playground that she had not been part of but had strong opinions about, and he listened and made the right sounds and thought, distantly, about a 1973 Porsche sitting in a climate-controlled garage in Greenwich with 7 wrong parts inside it. "Dad," Emma said at some point. "Yeah." "Is the car bad?" He looked at her. She was watching the television, not him, which meant she was actually paying attention to the question rather than to his face. "The car isn't bad," he said. "Someone did something bad to the car. Can you fix it?" He thought about that for longer than the question seemed to require. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Emma nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching television. She had a gift for believing in her father's competence that he found both sustaining and quietly terrifying. He had worked very hard to earn it and lived in moderate constant fear of losing it. He fell asleep on the couch before she did. He went back to the Hale estate 3 times that week. Each time, he arrived early and worked quietly, expanding his documentation of the tampered components and beginning the process of tracing the parts back through distributor records to understand where they'd come from and when they'd been installed. It was the kind of work that looks like nothing from the outside. A man sitting on the floor with a parts catalog and a laptop, but which is actually a form of reconstruction, building backward from evidence to event. On the 3rd day, Cora, the assistant with the paper notebook, brought him coffee without being asked. She set it on the floor beside him without interrupting what he was doing, and he thanked her without looking up, and she left. An hour later, she came back. "Ms. Hale asked me to give you something," she said. She handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten note on thick cream stationery. 3 sentences. "Patricia Owens called me yesterday. I've agreed to meet with her and her associate on Friday. Thank you for the introduction. VH." He folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket and went back to work. On his way home that evening, he called Patricia. "How'd the call go?" he asked. "She's smart," Patricia said. She was eating something. She was always eating when she talked on the phone, which she knew he found mildly aggravating and had never changed. "And she's scared, though she won't say so. The property deal you mentioned, Logan, there's more. I've only pulled the surface level and there's already more." "How much more?" "Enough that I've called in a friend who does forensic accounting," Patricia said. "How well do you know this woman, Victoria Hale?" "I've known her for about 2 weeks." "Do you trust her?" Logan thought about a woman sitting on a milk crate in a garage, not talking, waiting patiently for someone else to tell her something true. "Yeah," he said. "I think I do." "Good," Patricia said. Because what I'm starting to see, Logan, this isn't just the car. If this goes where I think it might go, she's going to need people around her who don't have a financial interest in what the answer turns out to be. He drove the rest of the way home with that sitting in the passenger seat beside him. He was back under a car the following Monday, a Mercedes E-Class with a torque converter that was trying its best to ruin someone's Tuesday, when Marcus leaned into the bay from the side. "Lady on the phone for you," Marcus said. "Says it's urgent, Greenwich area code." Logan rolled out on the creeper. "Which line?" "2. He picked up the wall phone, the one with the cracked plastic handle that he'd been meaning to replace for a year and a half. Victoria's voice was different this time, still controlled, but the control was being applied to something larger. "Patricia's associate, the accountant, he found something this morning," she said without preamble. "There are transfers between 3 shell companies that I've never seen before. One of them has my signature on the formation documents." Logan leaned against the workbench. "Your actual signature?" "It looks exactly like my signature," Victoria said. "Patricia says it could be a forgery. It could also be something I signed without reading, buried in a quarterly compliance packet." A pause. "I don't know which is worse." Logan looked out the open garage bay door at the parking lot and the gray September sky beyond it. "Is Damien in the office today?" he asked. "He's in the building. He doesn't know about any of this yet." "Don't let him know," Logan said. "Not yet. Don't change anything. Don't access anything in his systems. Don't move any of your accounts. Don't do anything that would tip him off that something's changed." "You sound like you've done this before." "I haven't," Logan said. "But I've watched enough things get complicated fast when the wrong person finds out too early." Logan. He noticed she had dropped the Mr. Carter somewhere in the past 2 weeks. He hadn't noted it consciously until this moment. "We're going to need to talk about how this ends," she said. "Not today, but soon." "I know," he said. He hung up and stood for a moment with his hand still on the cracked plastic handle. Marcus was watching him from the office doorway with the politely curious expression of a man who has learned when not to ask questions. "I'm going to need you to cover Thursday and Friday," Logan said. Marcus nodded slowly. "Big job?" "Something like that," Logan said. He went back under the Mercedes. The torque converter was still a problem. The torque converter, at least, was a problem he knew how to solve. He hadn't told Victoria about Hans Brecker yet. Not the full story. Not who Hans was to him. What those months in Stuttgart had meant. What the workshop had given him. And what he had lost afterward when the structure of his life had rearranged itself catastrophically around a diagnosis and then an absence. He hadn't told her because it wasn't relevant. Not professionally. He'd seen the work. He'd recognized it. That was what mattered for the purpose of authenticating the engine. But in the evenings, after Emma was in bed, he occasionally sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and thought about Hans. Thought about the specific quality of the man's attention, the way he'd approached every engine as if it were a conversation rather than a problem. "You must listen to what it tells you," Hans had said, roughly, in the mixture of German and approximate English they'd communicated in. "Not what you assume, what it tells." Logan had been 23. He'd gone to Germany on a program that no longer existed, funded by a manufacturer that had since been absorbed into a conglomerate. He had been good at the work, but not yet great, and he had known the difference. Hans had not been kind, exactly, but he had been honest about what Logan was capable of in a way that nobody before or since had been, and that honesty had operated on him like a slow-acting compound, doing its real work years after the initial exposure. He thought about that now as the coffee went cold and the apartment was quiet around him. He thought about a woman who had been betrayed by the person she trusted most. And he thought about 7 components in a Porsche engine bay, placed there with the patience and precision of someone who had calculated, correctly, that nobody would look closely enough. He had looked closely. That was all it had been, really. He had looked closely. He picked up his coffee, drank the cold remainder in one deliberate swallow, and went to bed. The forensic accountant's name was Gerald Fitch, and he was not what Logan had expected. He was short, somewhere in his early 60s, with the kind of unremarkable face that belongs to men who have spent their entire careers being underestimated in conference rooms. He wore a short-sleeved button-down shirt tucked into khaki pants, carried a canvas briefcase that looked like it had survived a moderate flood at some point, and spoke in a voice so quiet that people consistently leaned forward when he talked, which Logan suspected was entirely intentional. Patricia had arranged the meeting for a Thursday evening at her office, a two-room suite above a State Farm insurance agency in downtown Stamford, which she shared with another attorney who did immigration work. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. There was a folding table pushed against the window with 3 laptops open on it, and a printer that had been making a concerning noise since Logan arrived. Victoria sat across from Gerald with a yellow legal pad in front of her that she hadn't written anything on yet. She was in the same kind of business clothing she always seemed to be in, but there were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, and she held her coffee cup with both hands the way people do when they're working hard to project calm. Logan sat to her left. He hadn't entirely been sure why he was there. His part of this was the car, the mechanical evidence, the authentication chain. But Patricia had asked him to come, and Victoria had not objected, so here he was, in a folding chair that wobbled slightly on one leg, listening to Gerald Fitch explain in his very quiet voice how a company's financial blood could be drained slowly enough that no single person noticed until most of it was gone. "The structure is actually elegant," Gerald said, and he used that word without any admiration, just precision. 3 shell entities, 2 registered in Delaware, 1 in Nevada. The Delaware entities have legitimate business purposes on paper. They appear to be holding companies for real estate assets. The Nevada entity is cleaner, harder to trace, registered through a nominee service in 2021. "Damien set those up?" Victoria asked. "The formation documents on 2 of them carry a signature matching yours and his. On the 3rd, it's only his. My working theory is that the 2 with your signature were buried in compliance packets, periodic filings where executives sign off on subsidiary formations as a batch, the kind of thing a busy person countersigns without reading individually." Victoria set down her coffee cup. "That's—" She stopped. "It's common," Gerald said, not unkindly. "It's designed to be common." "What have the transfers looked like?" Patricia asked. Gerald opened one of the laptops and turned it to face the table. "I've traced 4 distinct transfer chains so far. The amounts vary. Some are small, under 50,000, sized to avoid automatic flagging. Some are larger and structured as consulting fees or advisory retainers paid to entities that, when you follow them, don't appear to have any employees or operating history." "Total exposure?" Victoria's voice was flat. "So far, I can document approximately 3.2 million. He paused. "I want to be clear that I believe this is a partial number. I've been working with the records you've provided, and I expect there are accounts and structures I haven't seen yet." The room was quiet for a moment, except for the printer's intermittent complaint. Logan had been looking at the laptop screen from his angle. He couldn't read the specific figures, but the architecture of what Gerald was showing was visible. Column after column of transactions, cross-referenced against entity names that change slightly each time. The way a forgery changes slightly each time, the forger tries to reproduce the original. He had seen the same logic in the Porsche, different discipline, same thinking. "The real estate deal," Logan said, "the one in the Bronx." Everyone looked at him. "The property transaction," he said to Victoria, "the one you mentioned. Can you walk through that one specifically?" Gerald looked at Patricia, who gave a small nod. "The Bronx acquisition," Gerald said, pulling up a different screen. "Commercial property, mixed-use zoning, purchased in November of last year through a distressed asset process. Hale Capital's involvement was structured as a bridge loan to the acquiring entity, with an option to convert to equity within 18 months. He paused. "The acquiring entity is one of the Delaware shells. So Hale Capital loaned money to an entity that Damien controls," Victoria said slowly. "At below-market interest," Gerald added, 3.5% on a 12-month bridge. Market rate for that risk profile would have been 9 to 11. Which means Hale Capital is the lender, Damien's shell company is the borrower, and the interest terms are favorable enough that it's essentially a transfer dressed up as a loan, Patricia said. "That's the charitable reading," Gerald said. Victoria stood up. She didn't walk anywhere. The room wasn't big enough for pacing. She just stood, her chair scraping back, and put both hands on the table and looked at the laptop screen. Logan watched her face. There was no drama in it. She looked like someone doing arithmetic that she wished would come out differently, knowing it wasn't going to. "He's been planning this," she said. It wasn't a question. The earliest transaction I've found with this pattern dates to 2 years ago, Gerald said. Small, almost like a test. Like he wanted to see if anyone would notice, Logan said. That's a reasonable interpretation. Victoria straightened up and turned toward the window. Outside, Stamford's downtown was doing whatever it did on a Thursday night. A few cars, a bar across the street, with its neon sign reflecting in the wet pavement. Rain had started at some point while they'd been inside. The Porsche, she said, without turning around. How does the Porsche connect to this financially? Logan answered. If the car's authentication fails, if an independent assessment determines it's not a true matching numbers vehicle because of the replaced components, the insurance value drops. You paid $480 for it. An unmatched car in that condition might appraise at $80,000 to $90,000. That's roughly $400,000 in paper loss. To whom? To you, Logan said. But if someone had a short position on the insured value, if an insurance instrument existed that would pay out on the depreciation of a declared asset, he stopped. That's outside my lane, Gerald. Gerald was already nodding. I flagged this 2 days ago. There's a specialty insurance policy on the Porsche purchased through a broker we're still tracing. The policy is structured unusually. It covers the car for its purchase value, but includes a clause that pays a settlement to the policyholder in the event of an authentication failure resulting in value loss. Who's the policyholder? Patricia asked. The policy was purchased by one of the Delaware entities, Gerald said. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. So the car was sabotaged, Victoria said, still at the window, to fail authentication, which would trigger an insurance payout to a shell company that Damien controls, while I eat the loss on an asset I bought based on his recommendation. That's what the documents suggest, Gerald said. $400,000, she said. He did all of this for $400,000. The car was likely one piece, Patricia said carefully, not the main event. Victoria turned around. Her expression had changed, not collapsed exactly, but resolved into something harder, the kind of hardness that isn't anger yet, that's still in the stage before anger where everything is just very clear. How do we protect the company? She asked. And that question, Logan thought, was the thing that mattered. Not how could he or I trusted him for 12 years, or any of the things a different person might have said in that room at that moment. She had gone straight to the company, the thing she'd built, the structure that 300 people worked inside. He found himself thinking that he respected her for that, in the uncomplicated way that you sometimes respect a stranger for doing the hard thing without theater. Patricia and Gerald began talking through the protective steps, account monitoring, legal holds, communication protocols. Logan listened for a while and then let his attention drift slightly, the way it does when a conversation has moved past the part where your input is useful. He was thinking about Damien Cross. He hadn't met the man. He'd seen a photograph on the Hale Capital website, mid-40s, silver-templed, the kind of face that reads as trustworthy in a way that is almost certainly intentional. The website described him as co-founder and chief investment officer with 22 years of experience in alternative assets. There was a quote attributed to him about long-term value creation that sounded like something generated by a committee. Logan thought about the Porsche, about the level of knowledge required to choose those 7 specific components. Not any 7, but the 7 that would cause performance issues and authentication failure without being obvious to a non-specialist. Whoever had done that work understood vintage Porsche mechanics at a depth that took years to acquire. Was that Damien? Or someone Damien had hired? He wrote a note on his phone. Who actually installed the components? Not the financier, the mechanic. He underlined it. The meeting broke up around 10 o'clock. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady fall. Victoria and Logan ended up walking to the parking lot at the same time, both of them slightly surprised to find themselves moving in the same direction. Your car's here? She asked. Truck, he said. Far end. They walked together for a moment without talking, which should have been awkward but wasn't, particularly. Gerald's going to want more documents, Victoria said. He'll find more, Logan said. That's what I'm afraid of. The streetlight at the corner of the lot had a flicker in it, cycling through some electrical malfunction that made the whole block feel slightly unstable. Logan stopped at his truck. Victoria had a town car waiting at the street entrance. The driver had gotten out and was holding an umbrella, which she waved off. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. The engine modification, the one you recognized. You said you watched someone do it. Who was that? Logan opened his truck door. He wasn't avoiding the question exactly. He was just deciding how much of it was relevant right now. A man named Hans Brecker, he said, German engineer. I spent about 6 months working in his shop in Stuttgart a long time ago. He was exceptional. One of those people who thinks about mechanical systems differently than other people do. Is he still working? He passed away about 4 years ago. Logan said it without weight because it had already been absorbed. Heart attack. He was 74. Victoria looked at him with an expression that was hard to categorize. Not pity, something more careful than that. I'm sorry, she said. He was a hard man to work for, Logan said. But he was honest. He told you exactly what he thought of your work. And if it was bad, he said so. And if it was good, he said that too. He didn't have a polite version of either. Those are the people you remember, Victoria said. Yeah, Logan said. She turned toward her car, then stopped. Logan, she said, and it was the first time she had used just his first name, no last, and it landed differently in the air than anything that had come before it. Be careful. Whatever this is, Damien is not someone who loses gracefully. He looked at her. I'm a mechanic in Stamford, he said. I don't think I'm on his radar. She didn't argue with that. She just gave him a look that said she hoped he was right, walked to her town car, and got in. Logan sat in his truck for a moment with the heat running and the rain hitting the windshield in overlapping patterns. He had told Victoria the practical truth. He probably wasn't on Damien's radar. But he had been around enough complicated situations, in the years before Stamford, before Emma, before the garage and the quiet life he'd assembled from broken pieces, to know that radar has a habit of expanding. He drove home. Emma was asleep. Marcus had picked her up from after-school care and left a note on the counter that said she ate 2 pieces of pizza and tried to negotiate a third. I said no. You're welcome. Logan stood at Emma's bedroom door for a moment in the dark, watching the small rise and fall of her breathing, then went to bed. He didn't sleep particularly well. The week that followed was the kind of week that looks ordinary from outside and is quietly ferocious on the inside. Logan continued working on the Porsche during morning sessions, cataloging the modified components and beginning the long process of sourcing correct replacements through a network of vintage Porsche specialists he'd cultivated over the years. Most of them were in Europe. One was in California and called himself the Pope of Air-Cooled, a title Logan found obnoxious, but the man's parts knowledge was genuinely exceptional, so he called him anyway. He spent his afternoons at the garage doing the actual work that paid his actual bills. The Mercedes, a Range Rover with electrical gremlins, a Saab that Marcus had accepted and then quietly panicked about because Marcus was excellent at most European makes and actively frightened of Saabs, which was a reasonable position. In the evenings, after Emma was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and went through the documents that Patricia had forwarded him, not the financial records, those were Gerald's territory, but the acquisition file for the Porsche, correspondence records, email chains, the sequence of how the deal had been assembled. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't a forensic accountant, but he was very good at reading the sequence of events in a mechanical repair and understanding what had happened in what order. He applied that same logic to the document timeline. What he found, on the third evening, was a gap. Between the authentication report, dated March of the previous year, issued by a documentation service in Zurich, and the first insurance policy application, dated 2 weeks later, there was a gap of 11 days. In those 11 days, based on the correspondence record, the car had been in transit, in a bonded transport facility in New Jersey. Logan stared at that gap for a long time, 11 days, in a facility that would have had access to the car, with the car out of Victoria's possession and not yet in the possession of anyone at Hale Capital. He emailed Patricia at 11:30 at night. The modification window. It's the transport gap. Someone had access during transit. Can Gerald find out who arranged the transport company? Patricia replied at 11:45. She was a night person, which Logan had known for years, already flagged. The transport company is a single-asset LLC, registered in New Jersey, 2 years old. Guess who the registered agent is? He stared at that message, then typed back, "The Nevada Shell?" 3 minutes passed. Close. Same registered agent as the Nevada Shell. Different entity, same fingerprints. Logan sat back. The transport company wasn't accidental. The 11-day gap wasn't a scheduling inconvenience. The car had been routed through an entity that Damien controlled, during which time, unhurried, unobserved, someone had replaced 7 components with the patience and precision of someone who had done exactly this before. The Porsche had never been a gift. It had been an instrument. He closed his laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a while, listening to the building make its nighttime sounds, pipes, settling walls, the distant sound of the upstairs neighbor's television. He thought about the kind of planning that this represented. The timeline extended back at least 2 years, based on Gerald's earliest flagged transaction. Damien Cross had been systematically positioning for this for a minimum of 2 years, possibly longer. The Porsche was one thread in a much larger piece of work, which meant Damien was either very confident or very desperate. Those two things looked identical from the outside, Logan had found, but they behaved very differently when pressure was applied. He went to bed. He thought he wouldn't sleep again, but he did. Abruptly and completely, the way exhaustion eventually overrides even a busy mind. The call from Victoria came the next afternoon, while he was in the middle of explaining to a customer, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Paulson with a 2014 Audi that she treated like a member of the family, why her A4 needed a timing chain service, and why it was better to address this now rather than in 6 months. He held up one finger to Mrs. Paulson, who was used to this, and stepped to the back of the garage. "Something happened this morning," Victoria said. She was speaking quietly, which meant she was in the building, probably her office, probably with the door closed. "Damien asked me to sign off on a capital reallocation, 60% of our liquid reserves into a new vehicle. He's framing it as an opportunistic investment." Logan kept his voice even. "Did you sign it?" "No. I said I needed the weekend to review." A pause. "Logan?" He pushed back harder than he's ever pushed on anything. He made it feel personal. He said I was second-guessing our partnership, that I've been distracted lately, that something has been off with me. Another pause. He was right that something has been off with me. He just doesn't know why. "Don't sign it." "I know that." "Have you talked to Patricia today?" "She's filing for a temporary injunction on the accounts this afternoon," Victoria said. "But Logan, once that's filed, Damien is going to know. The moment that injunction hits, he'll understand that someone has been looking at the accounts, that someone talked. He'll figure out it was you." "Yes." "And then he'll figure out how." The weight of that hung on the line between them for a moment. "I want to move Emma," Logan said, before he'd fully decided to say it. "Just temporarily. My sister lives in Westchester. I'll send her there for the weekend." There was a brief silence. "You think this could get—" "I don't know," Logan said honestly, "but I'd rather be wrong about it and have her in Westchester than be right and have her here." Victoria said quietly, "I'm sorry. This isn't what you signed up for." "You didn't sign up for it either," he said. He hung up and went back to Mrs. Paulson, who was examining a photograph of her A4's timing chain components with the focused concern of a grandmother reviewing a medical chart. "Is it serious?" she asked. "It's manageable," Logan said. "The car's going to be fine." He made his voice steady when he said it, the same way he always did. The same tone for a customer's anxiety and a genuine crisis and every register in between. It was a skill he'd developed without naming it, the ability to speak calmly when the situation didn't warrant calm, not to deceive, but because calm was occasionally the most useful thing a person could offer. He called his sister that evening. She didn't ask a lot of questions. She was the kind of woman who operated on the understanding that her younger brother did not ask favors without good reason. Emma thought the impromptu weekend trip was the greatest possible development. She packed her own bag, which contained 3 stuffed animals, a library book, and no clean socks, and Logan repacked it with the socks and drove her to Westchester Friday night and sat in his sister's kitchen drinking coffee while Emma commandeered the television. Driving back to Stamford alone, on a highway that was mostly empty at 9 o'clock on a Friday, Logan had the particular feeling of someone who has moved a fragile thing to a safer place and is now free to stand in the exposed spot themselves. It wasn't a heroic feeling. It was mostly just a feeling of clarity. The messy emotional part of the decision resolved, the thing remaining being only what it was. He didn't know what Damien Cross would do when the injunction hit. He didn't know if he was in the line of fire at all, or if he was standing well off to the side of something that would resolve itself entirely in boardrooms and courtrooms without touching his garage or his daughter or his small, carefully maintained life. What he knew was the car. What he knew was the engine. What he knew was Hans Brecker's unmistakable work sitting in a bay in Greenwich, surrounded by components that someone had placed there with the confidence of a person who expected never to be caught. That confidence was the mistake. Logan had spent his entire adult life working on things that other people had given up on, and he had learned something that turned out to apply well beyond engine bays. The moment a person becomes certain that no one is looking closely enough, they stop being careful in the ways that matter. He pulled into the lot behind the garage at 9:45. The building was dark. The parking lot had one working light in the far corner that cast more shadow than it displaced. He'd been telling the building owner about that light for 2 years. He got out of the truck. It was one of those September nights that has already made its decision about the season. Genuinely cold, the kind of cold that doesn't negotiate. He turned his collar up and fished for his keys. He had the key in the back door when his phone buzzed. Text from Patricia. Injunction filed at 4:47 p.m. Federal docket. Logan. Gerald found 2 more entities. We're now looking at potential exposure north of 6 million. This is bigger than any of us thought. He read the message twice. Then he went inside, made coffee because it was going to be a long night, sat down at his kitchen table, and started reading everything Gerald had sent over. $6 million. He thought about the Porsche again. The particular patience it had taken to route that car through a controlled transport facility, to replace components with precision, to construct an insurance mechanism that would convert the sabotage into a quiet payday. The attention to detail. The timeline. The mind that built this had been working on it for a long time, and now that mind was going to know that someone had been working on it from the other direction. Logan drank his coffee. He read the documents. Outside, the September night pressed against the windows, and the building made its sounds, and the garage below was dark and quiet. He had not felt afraid. Not yet. That would come later. In a way he hadn't anticipated. From a direction he hadn't been watching. But that night, he was just a man at a kitchen table with cold coffee and a legal pad, doing the thing he had always done, looking closely at something everyone else had missed, and following the truth wherever it led. The injunction hit Damian Cross's world on a Monday morning, and Logan heard about the fallout secondhand, the way people hear about earthquakes in other cities, through the reports of those who felt the ground move. Patricia called at 7:52 while Logan was dropping Emma off at the bus stop. He watched the yellow bus take the corner and then answered. He lawyered up within the hour, Patricia said. She sounded like someone who had been awake since before the injunction was news, which was probably accurate. Corporate defense firm out of Midtown. 3 partners, 12 associates. They filed a response by 9 o'clock this morning claiming the injunction is retaliatory and unsupported. How unsupported? Not remotely unsupported, Gerald submitted 46 exhibits. A brief pause during which Logan could hear her rifling through something. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what Damian did before he called the lawyers. Logan stood in the parking lot behind the garage. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of October morning that has a hard edge to it. He called Victoria, Patricia said. At 6:45 in the morning, she recorded it. What did he say? That someone had been feeding her lies, that the financial structures were legitimate and he could explain everything, that she was destroying a 12-year partnership over the manipulations of people who didn't understand how complex deals work. She paused. And then he said something interesting. He said, I know this didn't start with you. I know someone pushed you toward this. Logan absorbed that. He already knows about me, he said. It wasn't a question. He knows someone was looking at the Porsche. He knows the authentication chain was being examined, and he's smart enough to reverse engineer that someone pointed Victoria toward Patricia and Patricia toward Gerald. Another pause. Logan, I need you to be careful. Not paranoid, just careful. Damian Cross has been operating at a very high level for a long time. He doesn't panic. He pivots. Pivots to what? That's what I don't know yet. He went inside and opened the garage and worked on a 2017 Jaguar F-Pace with a broken climate control module, and he did the work competently and didn't think too much about anything else, because that was sometimes the only way to get through a morning. Marcus showed up at 8 and immediately sensed something, the way Marcus always sensed things, through the subtle atmospheric shifts that Logan was apparently not as good at concealing as he believed. "Bad day?" Marcus asked, setting down his coffee. "Day's fine," Logan said from underneath the Jaguar. "You've got that look?" "I don't have a look." "You absolutely have a look," Marcus said. "You had the same look last February when the transmission job took 2 weeks longer than you quoted, and you had to call Mrs. DiNapoli 3 times to extend the timeline." Logan rolled out on the creeper and looked up at Marcus, who was 31 and had worked at the garage for 4 years and possessed a cheerful, matter-of-fact perceptiveness that Logan found useful about 80% of the time and mildly exhausting the other 20. "I'm working on something complicated," Logan said. "It's fine, I've got it." "The Greenwich car?" "Yeah." Marcus nodded, picked up his coffee, and went to look at the Jaguar's service history on the computer. He didn't ask anything else, which was one of the things Logan genuinely valued about him. The complicated part of that week wasn't the legal maneuvering. That was Patricia and Gerald's territory, and they were both clearly built for it. The complicated part was the waiting. Logan had spent his adult life in a profession where diagnosis was followed relatively quickly by action. You identify the problem, you source the parts, you fix the thing. The timeline was measurable. The progress was visible. This was nothing like that. This was 3 days of calls and emails and documents being reviewed by people Logan didn't know, in offices he'd never seen. And his job in all of it was essentially to be available and to not do anything that would complicate the legal picture. Patricia had been clear about that. "You're a material witness at this point," she'd said. "Not in any formal sense yet, but potentially. Don't discuss the specifics with anyone outside this group. Don't reach out to anyone at Hale Capital other than Victoria, and only through channels we've established. And for the love of everything, don't go near Damien Cross." "I've never met Damien Cross," Logan said. "Good. Keep it that way." He picked Emma up from Westchester on Sunday. She came back with a handmade card that his sister's kids had helped her make, glitter and construction paper, that said, "I missed you, Dad," in letters of varying sizes. He kept it on the kitchen counter, propped against the salt shaker. Emma unpacked her bag, which now contained slightly more clean socks than it had left with, which was either a miracle or evidence that his sister had quietly intervened, and asked him if the car was fixed yet. "Getting there," he said. "How much longer?" "Couple more weeks, maybe." She accepted this with the philosophical resignation of a 7-year-old who has learned that complicated things take complicated amounts of time. Then she asked what was for dinner, and the conversation moved on. He had not told her anything, obviously. She was 7. But children read environments the way animals read weather, and Emma had been reading him with particular attention for the past week. The small, extra moments of watching him, the slightly tighter hug at bedtime, the way she'd asked twice that weekend if he was okay. He'd told her twice that he was fine, and both times it had been mostly true, which was usually the best you could do. Wednesday morning, Logan arrived at the garage at 6:30 as usual, and a black Mercedes GLS was parked in the lot. Not parked in the customer area, parked at the back, near the door Logan used to enter, which meant whoever was in it had been here long enough to figure out which door he used, which meant they'd been here a while. Logan stopped his truck 20 feet away and sat with the engine running for a moment. The Mercedes didn't move. He got out. The driver's door opened as he approached, and a man got out who was not what Logan had built in his mind over the past several weeks. Damien Cross was not tall. He was perhaps 5'10", maybe less in the flat morning light, with the silver-templed look from his website photograph, but carrying it differently in person, less polished, more tired. He was wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost $4,000 and hadn't been pressed recently. His face had the particular look of someone who has been sleeping poorly but refuses to let it show, which means it shows in specific ways. He was alone. No driver. No assistant. That detail, more than anything else about the moment, made Logan cautious. "Mr. Carter," Damien said. His voice was even, practiced even, the kind of even that isn't calm but has learned to impersonate it. "I apologize for coming unannounced. I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes." Logan stood about 8 feet away and kept his hands visible and easy. "About what?" he said. "About a situation that I believe has been significantly misrepresented to you." Damien put his hands in his coat pockets. a gesture that was probably intended to look casual and landed somewhere between that and contained. I understand you've been working on Victoria's car, and I understand that certain concerns have been raised around the acquisition. I'm a mechanic, Logan said. I work on the car. Of course. A small acknowledgement-type smile that didn't involve his eyes. But you've also been in contact with Patricia Owens, who filed an injunction against my accounts on Friday, and her forensic accountant has been given access to proprietary company documents. He paused. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm simply trying to understand the sequence of events. You should probably talk to an attorney about any of that, Logan said. I have attorneys, Damien said. What I'm trying to avoid is a situation that damages everyone involved, including Victoria, based on a misunderstanding of some genuinely complex financial structures. He took one hand out of his pocket. In it was an envelope. He set it on the hood of Logan's truck with a careful, deliberate movement. I'm prepared to make this worth your time, to make it worth your withdrawal from a situation you were pulled into through no fault of your own. Logan looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it. How much? He said. $200,000, Damien said. Wired to any account you specify within 48 hours. In exchange for your cooperation, meaning your testimony, if it comes to that, reflects only what you can specifically verify about the car, the mechanical elements. Nothing about documentation chains, transport companies, or financial structures that are frankly outside your area of expertise. The morning was very quiet around them. A truck passed on the road outside, and then the quiet came back. That's a lot of money for a mechanic, Logan said. It's a fair amount for someone in a complicated position, Damien said. Logan thought about the 7 components in the Porsche, about the 11-day transport gap, about Patricia's voice on the phone saying north of $6 million, about Gerald Fitch's quiet voice describing shell companies and nominee agents and a forgery that bore Victoria's signature. He thought about Victoria sitting on a milk crate in a garage, not talking, waiting for someone to tell her something true. No, Logan said. Damien's expression didn't change immediately. There was a beat, just one, where something moved underneath the composure, something that Logan couldn't name exactly, but recognized by its weight. Mr. Carter, Damien said, still in that even voice, I want to be clear that I'm not making a threat. I'm offering a resolution. I heard you, Logan said. The answer is no. The answer? Damien looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up the envelope from the truck's hood, folded it once, and put it back in his coat pocket. A gesture so deliberate it was almost theatrical. Emma is at Washington Elementary, Damien said. Logan's body processed this before his mind did. Something changed in his chest. Not fear exactly, but something older and more instinctive than fear, the thing that lives underneath it. She walks home on Wednesdays, Damien continued, his voice not louder, not harder, just utterly level. Left on Maplewood, right on Chester, down the hill past the park. About 12 minutes if she doesn't stop to look at the dogs on the fence at the corner of Chester and 3rd. Logan was very still. I'm telling you this, Damien said, not as a threat, but as information, as context for the decision you're making. He looked at Logan directly for the first time, and in that look there was something that had been there all along, beneath the practiced surface. A complete absence of the usual barriers between one person and another. Not cruelty, exactly. Something colder than that. You have something that matters to you. I think you understand that I'm pointing at it. Logan said nothing. $200,000, Damien said quietly. Or the alternative, which is a situation that becomes very complicated very quickly for a single father with no legal resources and a business that operates on thin margins. He paused. Think about what actually matters to you. He got back in the Mercedes. The engine started. He drove out of the lot and turned right on the road and was gone. Logan stood in the parking lot for a long time. The morning was still cold and clear. A bird was doing something in the oak tree at the lot's edge. From inside the garage, the clock on the wall made its ordinary tick. His hands were not shaking. He noticed this with a kind of distant objectivity, the way you notice the temperature of water before stepping into it. His hands were still, and his breathing was normal, and the operational part of his brain was already doing the things it did when a situation required response rather than reaction. He called Patricia first. She answered on the second ring. He told her what had happened, in order, without editorializing. She was quiet throughout, which was unlike her, and when he finished, she said a single word that he'd heard her say before in contexts he didn't need to remember right now. "Logan," she said after a moment. "He just handed us the case." "I know that," he said, "but I need Emma." "Where is she?" "School. She's in school right now. She's fine, but she walks home on Wednesdays." "I'm calling you back in 10 minutes, Patricia said. "Don't move." She hung up. He went inside the garage and stood in the middle of the floor and did nothing for about 4 minutes, which was the hardest 4 minutes he'd experienced in a long time. Doing nothing is its own kind of discipline. The impulse was to drive to the school, to pull Emma out of class, to put her in the truck and take her somewhere and stand between her and everything. But that impulse, acted on, would tip off the school, generate records, potentially complicate the legal picture, and, more than anything else, scare Emma in a way that would be hard to walk back. So he stood in the middle of the floor and breathed. Marcus arrived at 8 and looked at Logan and clearly understood that this was not a morning for the usual conversation. He made coffee, put a cup on the workbench near Logan, and went directly to the sob that had been waiting since last week. Patricia called back in 11 minutes. "Okay," she said. "Here's what's happening. First, Emma. I have a friend who works with the Stamford PD, nothing official, but he owes me. He's going to have an unmarked car near the school for the rest of the week, just presence. Damien's too smart to do anything visible, but visible presence changes the calculation." "Thank you," Logan said, and meant it in a way that didn't need more words. "Second," Patricia continued, "what Damien did this morning is witness intimidation, federal charge potentially. He referenced your daughter by school, route, and behavioral detail. That's not accidental information, Logan. That's surveillance. Someone has been watching Emma's routine." The cold that moved through Logan at that was different from the cold outside. It settled lower. "I've been watching for that," he said. "I haven't seen anyone." "You wouldn't necessarily see it, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that he said it. And you're going to write down everything he said, word for word, right now before anything fades, time, location, exact phrasing, and then you're going to send it to me and to Gerald." "Gerald? Why Gerald?" "Because Gerald is now talking to the FBI, Patricia said, and her voice had shifted into something cleaner and more serious than he'd heard from her before. "Logan, this is not a civil matter anymore. This crossed into federal territory the moment those wire transfers showed up, and it crossed into something else entirely this morning. I need you to understand that." He understood it. "What do I do?" he asked. "You go to work," Patricia said. "You don't change your routine. You don't reach out to Damien or anyone connected to him. You document this morning and you send it to me. And you call your sister about Emma." "Already thinking about it. One more thing," Patricia said. "Victoria needs to know about this morning, today. Not because she needs to be scared, but because she needs to understand what she's dealing with. She's been holding the belief, somewhere in the back of her mind, that Damien wouldn't go past a certain line. He crossed it this morning." Logan ended the call. He sat down on the stool by the workbench and took the legal pad from the shelf where he kept it, and wrote down everything Damien had said. Every word he could recall, in order, with the timestamp at the top. His handwriting was calm and clear, which surprised him faintly. He read it back once. Then he photographed it and sent it to Patricia. Then he sat there for another moment with the legal pad in his hands and allowed himself to feel, just briefly, the thing he'd been holding back since the parking lot. Emma walking down Chester Street. Left on Maplewood, right on Chester, down the hill past the park. 12 minutes if she doesn't stop to look at the dogs. Someone had watched her, had clocked her route, had carried that information into a Monday morning conversation as casually as a business card. The feeling that moved through him was not rage. It was too cold and too precise for rage. It was the feeling of understanding something about a situation that changes its nature completely. Up until this morning, this had been a financial fraud case that Logan had been drawn into through a particular mechanical coincidence. Something he could walk away from if he chose. A situation that had consequences and stakes, but whose geometry, fundamentally, didn't include his daughter. Damien Cross had changed the geometry, and in doing so, had made a specific kind of error that Logan recognized from engine diagnostics. The error of the person who is so confident in their leverage that they fail to account for what happens when leverage hardens the other side. He put the legal pad back on the shelf. "Marcus," he said. Marcus looked up from the sob. I need to make a couple of calls. I'll be in the office. The F-Pace at 11 is yours if you can handle it. I can handle it, Marcus said, without drama. Logan went into the small office at the back of the garage, a room barely large enough for a desk, 2 filing cabinets, and a chair that had been there since he bought the business, and called Victoria. She answered on the first ring. I know, she said before he could speak. Patricia called me. Logan, She stopped. When she continued, her voice was different. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. I'm sorry that You didn't put him up to it, Logan said. This isn't about you. Your daughter. She's okay. I'm handling it. A long pause. What do you need from me? Victoria asked. I need you to be where Patricia tells you to be and do what she tells you to do, Logan said. I need you not to contact Damien, not to access any of his systems, and not to be alone at the company until this resolves. He paused. Do you have someone you trust there? Not in his orbit? My CFO, Victoria said. Helen Marsh. She's been with the company for 7 years. She's not connected to Damien. She never liked him particularly. Tell Helen what's happening, at the level Patricia approves. You need someone in the building who knows. Okay, Victoria said. Victoria. He said her name the same way she'd said his that first night in the parking lot, with the weight of something being said plainly that had been implied for a while. He just made this federal. The FBI is involved now. Whatever he thought he was doing this morning, he miscalculated badly. I know, she said quietly. I know he did. But Logan, he's going to know it too, very soon. And when Damien Cross realizes he's made a mistake, he doesn't retreat. He accelerates. That word settled in the small office like the temperature dropping. I know, Logan said. He meant it. He spent the rest of that morning working on a 2015 Audi with a failing water pump, a straightforward job, mechanical cause, and mechanical solution, the satisfying simplicity of a problem with a clear answer. He worked carefully and without haste, and when the job was done, he drove the Audi into the lot and parked it and stood for a moment in the clear autumn air with his hands in his pockets. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't know, which turned out, when he read the message, to be Special Agent Daniel Reyes from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in New Haven, who had been given Logan's number by Patricia Owens and who would like to schedule a conversation at Logan's earliest convenience. The message was formal and specific, and made the whole thing real in a way that the previous weeks had been building toward but hadn't yet achieved. He texted back that he was available Thursday morning. Agent Reyes replied, Thursday 9 a.m., our field office on Atlantic Street, Stamford. I'll send the address. Thank you, Mr. Carter. Logan looked at the message for a moment. Then he typed back, I'll be there. He called his sister that evening. She said yes before he finished explaining, which was how she had always operated, assessing the core of a situation quickly and responding to that rather than the surrounding details. Emma could stay as long as needed. Emma would love it. Emma would be fine. Emma herself, when Logan told her over dinner that she'd be spending some more time at Aunt Rachel's, looked at him with those particular dark eyes that saw more than he always remembered to account for. Is this because of the car? She asked. Logan considered lying. It was a genuine consideration, the kind of consideration you have when you are a parent, and the truth is complicated and your child is 7. But Emma had always been able to tell when he was managing her rather than talking to her, and she didn't like it, and she was right not to. Yes, he said, the car situation got a little complicated. Nothing bad is going to happen, but I want you somewhere comfortable while I sort it out. Emma processed this with the solemn attention of a child taking on actual information. Are you going to be okay? She asked. Yes, he said, and this time there was no hesitation in it. She nodded. Okay, then, can I bring both the big stuffed bear and the penguin this time? You can bring whatever you want, he said. She went back to eating and he watched her for a moment. The ordinary miracle of her, eating dinner at the kitchen table under the light, completely present in the immediate world of her meal and her thoughts, and the slight injustice of having only one piece of garlic bread left, and felt, in his chest, something that was equal parts love and the particular cold clarity of a person who has decided completely and without reservation what they are willing to stand for. Damien Cross had made this personal. Logan hadn't wanted it personal. He'd wanted to fix a car, document some fraud, hand the evidence to people whose job it was to do something with it, and go back to his garage and his daughter and his mornings at the bus stop. But personal is not a preference. Sometimes it is just what a situation becomes. He drove Emma to Westchester the next morning. He watched his sister's front door close behind her. He sat in the car for a moment in the driveway with the engine running and Rachel's fall wreath on the door and the sound of Emma already talking at high volume about something through the walls. Then he drove back to Stamford. He had a Thursday morning appointment with the FBI. He had a 1973 Porsche in Greenwich that was not yet finished. And somewhere in a glass-walled office in Midtown Manhattan, a man in a $4,000 overcoat was about to realize that the mechanic he had visited at dawn on a Monday morning had not done what he expected. Some people, when the ground shifts under them, look for the nearest exit. Logan Carter, as it turned out, was not one of those people. The FBI field office on Atlantic Street in Stamford occupied the fourth floor of a building that also contained a dental practice and a regional insurance adjuster, which Logan found somehow fitting. Federal authority tucked between ordinary commerce, invisible until you needed it. Special Agent Daniel Reyes was younger than Logan had expected, mid-30s, with the alert, slightly compressed quality of someone who has trained himself to take up less space than he naturally would. He wore a dark suit that fit well and carried a legal pad and a cup of coffee that he didn't drink during the entire 2-hour conversation. He had a second agent with him, a woman named Carver, who took notes and asked occasional precise questions that revealed she had read everything Gerald had submitted in considerable detail. Logan sat across from them at a conference table with a window that looked out over a parking structure and told them everything. He started with the phone call from Victoria. He went through the diagnosis, the 7 components, Hans Brecker's modification, the transport gap, the conversations with Patricia and Gerald. He described the Monday morning in his parking lot with the accuracy of someone who had written it down within 20 minutes of it happening and read it back several times since. When he got to the part about Emma's school and the walking route, Agent Reyes put down his pen. "He used her name?" Reyes asked. "No," Logan said. "He said Emma, just the first name." "And the route detail? Maplewood to Chester, past the park." "Yes." He knew which corner she stopped at. "There's a house with dogs in the yard on Chester and 3rd. She looks at them every time." Reyes and Carver exchanged a look that carried more information between them than Logan could fully read. "Mr. Carter," Reyes said, "I want to be straightforward with you about where we are. We've been developing this case for 3 weeks since Patricia Owens contacted our Financial Crimes Division. Gerald Fitch's documentation is solid. The wire fraud exposure is clear and substantial." He paused. "What happened Monday morning changed the trajectory significantly. Witness intimidation with a minor referenced as implicit leverage, that's a separate charge. And it's the kind of charge that tends to focus prosecutorial attention in specific ways. Meaning it makes the case stronger," Logan said. "Meaning it makes Damian Cross's situation considerably worse than it was Sunday night," Reyes said. "And it tells us something about his state of mind. People who feel confident in their position don't visit mechanics at dawn." Logan had thought the same thing. He didn't say so. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "For now, your written statement, which you've already prepared, Tom. Thank you for that. Your continued cooperation, meaning if anything else happens, you contact me directly." Reyes slid a card across the table. "And continued access to your documentation on the Porsche authentication, which we'd like to formally enter as evidence." "All of it's yours," Logan said. "One more thing," Carver said. It was the first time she'd spoken directly. Her voice was level and unhurried. "The person who actually installed the modified components, you've said in your written account that the skill level required suggests someone with deep vintage Porsche knowledge. Do you have a candidate?" Logan had thought about this. He'd been thinking about it since the week before, sitting in his kitchen with Gerald's documents and the question he'd written on his phone, not the financier. "The mechanic. I've been going through the vintage Porsche restoration community," he said. "It's a small world. There are maybe 30-40 people in the Northeast with the specific knowledge to do what was done to that car without it being detectable to a non-specialist. I've been quietly asking around. Not about this case, just general questions about who's been doing acquisition work, who handles authentication prep for private sales." "And?" "There's a name that came up twice," Logan said. A man named Stefan Voss. He runs a private restoration shop out of a facility in Westchester. He worked at a major Porsche racing program in the late 90s, then went independent. He's done authentication consulting for private collectors, including some European buyers. He paused. He knows what matching numbers documentation looks like, and he knows what can be changed to affect it. Carver wrote the name down. We'll look at him, Reyes said. Don't contact him yourself. I wasn't going to, Logan said. He drove back to Stamford feeling lighter in a specific way. Not relieved, not confident, but relieved of the particular weight of carrying information alone. He had handed everything to people who had the tools and authority to do something with it. That was the correct sequence. He went back to work. The next 10 days moved at 2 speeds simultaneously. In the garage, time flowed normally, the ordinary rhythm of diagnoses and repairs and customer conversations, and Marcus's ongoing conflict with the Saab, which turned out to have an electrical fault so obscure that Logan eventually called a specialist in Massachusetts who diagnosed it over the phone and charged $200 for the pleasure. That felt like a reasonable price. The Saab's owner, a retired professor named Dr. Kamathi, who had inexplicable faith in the car, despite its consistent unreliability, was understanding about the delays in the patient way of someone who expects complications. But underneath that normal rhythm, things were moving fast in directions Logan could only partially track. Patricia called on a Tuesday to say that Gerald had uncovered 2 additional shell entities, bringing the total documented exposure to just under $7 million. She said it the way a doctor reports a test result, with precision and a deliberate absence of drama that is itself a form of drama. 7 million, Logan said. Documented, she said. Gerald thinks the actual number is higher, but he can't trace everything with what we have. The FBI subpoena should open some additional accounts. Has the subpoena gone out? Yesterday. Logan absorbed that. How's Victoria? He asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She's holding. She's been dealing with her board. They found out through a news alert, which is not ideal. Someone leaked that there was a federal investigation touching Hale Capital, and by Tuesday afternoon there were 3 journalists outside the building. Was her name in it? As the victim, yes. The coverage it's been complicated. Some of it is sympathetic. Some of it is the kind that asks questions about how a CEO didn't notice this for 2 years, which is a fair question even if the timing is brutal. Logan had seen one of the articles. He hadn't sought it out. Marcus had shown him on his phone, with the expression of someone who has connected 2 things and is unsure whether to mention it. The article was from a financial news outlet and used the phrase questions of oversight twice. There was a photograph of Victoria from some prior event, smiling in the way people smile when photographs are being taken, which was the wrong kind of photograph for that article, and someone at the publication had known that. He had felt something reading it that he didn't fully examine. It was in the territory of anger, but quieter than that. Victoria called him that same evening, from what sounded like her car. The specific acoustic quality of a phone call in a moving vehicle, slightly compressed. I assume you've seen it, she said. Some of it, he said. The board wants an emergency meeting. They're talking about a restructuring committee, which is their way of saying they want to put someone else in charge while the investigation concludes. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the effort in it. Helen is fighting for me. She sent a 20-page memo to every board member this afternoon detailing the fraud structure and making the case that I was the primary victim of a sophisticated scheme. Is that true? Logan asked. He meant it as a genuine question, not a challenge. Yes, Victoria said, but being right doesn't always matter as much as it should. No, he agreed. It doesn't. A silence. Logan, can I ask you something I probably shouldn't? Sure. Do you think I should have seen this? She said. Honestly, not the legal answer. Not what Patricia would say. Do you think... Is there something I missed that a careful person would have caught? He thought about that seriously, because she deserved a serious answer. I think Damien is very good at this, he said finally. I think someone who is very good at this, working from the inside of a relationship you trusted, can hide things from careful people. The structures were built specifically to be invisible to you. He paused. But I also think there were probably moments, not obvious ones, just moments where something felt slightly off, and you explained it to yourself because the alternative was uncomfortable. Victoria was quiet. Yeah, she said softly. There were moments. That's not stupidity, Logan said. That's just being human. Another silence, longer this time. Thank you for not lying about it, she said. You asked me not to, he said. She almost laughed at that. It was a small, exhausted sound, but it was real. I did, didn't I? He went to bed that night thinking about the board meeting and the article and the particular exposure that comes when a private disaster becomes public, when the thing you've been containing in conference rooms and attorneys' offices suddenly exists in the world outside, and strangers form opinions about it from photograph captions. He had been through his own version of that, after Claire died, the way people look at a widowed father of a toddler, the specific combination of sympathy and unexamined judgment, the comments that were meant as comfort and arrived as something else. He had learned to be in that exposure without being destroyed by it, but it had taken time, and he'd done it badly before he'd done it better. Victoria was doing it in public, in front of cameras, with her professional competence as the specific thing being questioned. He hoped she had people around her who knew how to be useful in that. The following Monday, 4 weeks after Logan had first stood in the garage at the Hale estate and gone still at the site of Hans Brecker's work, a team of federal agents executed search warrants simultaneously on 3 locations: Damian Cross's offices at Hale Capital, his personal residence in Darien, and a storage facility in White Plains that turned out to contain, among other things, a filing cabinet full of documents that Gerald Fitch would later describe, in the measured language of someone trying not to show excitement, as comprehensive. Logan heard about it from Patricia at 8 in the morning while he was changing the oil on a Honda that belonged to Marcus's cousin. It's happening right now, Patricia said. 3 locations at once, federal marshals. They moved this morning because there was intelligence suggesting Damian was planning to travel next week. Possibly out of the country. Logan set down the oil filter. Is Victoria okay? She's at the office. Helen is with her. The board meeting is postponed pending the investigation outcome, which is a win for her. A pause. Logan, they found Stefan Voss. Where? At the White Plains facility. Not in person, but his name is on contracts, invoices, a consulting agreement with one of the shells. He appears to have been paid $40,000 in cash equivalents over an 18-month period. The FBI picked him up this morning at his shop in Westchester. The Honda's oil was draining into the pan. Logan watched it for a moment. Did he talk? Logan asked. Too early to know, Patricia said. But here's the thing. The 40,000. Logan, that's nothing. For a person with Voss's knowledge and the legal exposure involved, 40,000 is almost insultingly small, which means either Damian had something on him or Voss didn't fully understand what he was part of. Or he trusted Damian, Logan said. Yes, Patricia said. Or that. The news broke by afternoon. A financial reporter at the Wall Street Journal had a source inside the federal building, or close enough to it, and by 2 o'clock there were alerts going to phones across the financial world. By 4 o'clock, every major news outlet was running the story. By 6, the television trucks were in Darien. Logan watched none of it in real time. He was finishing a brake job on a Ford Escape when Marcus came to the bay door with his phone. It's everywhere, Marcus said, and his voice was the particular register of someone who has been watching a slow-moving thing suddenly go fast. They're saying he's being arrested. Damian Cross. Wire fraud. Corporate theft. Something about a witness. Logan straightened up from the brake caliper. Witness intimidation, Logan said. Marcus looked at him. Logan, Marcus said slowly. How deep are you in this? Logan looked at his assistant. This person who had worked beside him for 4 years, who had covered his schedule and fed his daughter leftover pizza and never once pressed for information he wasn't offered. Deep enough, Logan said, but it's going the right direction now. Marcus nodded once, put his phone in his pocket, and went back to work without another word. That was worth something. Logan made a note to himself to give Marcus a real raise as soon as the business could support it. Damian Cross was formally arrested at his Darien residence at 5:47 in the evening. The charges filed were federal wire fraud, corporate theft, obstruction of justice, and witness intimidation, the last charge specifically referencing Logan's written statement and the surveillance of Emma's route to school. Logan learned about the specific charges from Patricia, who called from what sounded like a restaurant or a bar, her voice carrying a tone he had never heard from her before. Something approaching satisfaction, but careful with it, the way you hold something hot. "He was arraigned this evening," she said. "No bail granted. The federal prosecutor made the argument that given the out-of-country travel plans and the asset exposure, flight risk was substantial." "No bail," Logan repeated. "He's not going home tonight," Patricia said, "or for the foreseeable future." Logan was sitting on the floor of his garage at this point, not working, just sitting with his back against the BMW that was next in the queue, legs stretched out. The garage was dark except for the work light he hadn't turned off. He had a cup of coffee beside him that had been hot an hour ago. "How is he taking it?" Logan asked. According to people who were in the room, not well. The composure cracked during arraignment. There was an exchange between him and his attorney that got terse in front of the judge. A pause. He said something about how this would be corrected. The judge told him to be quiet. Logan thought about the man who had stood in his parking lot at 7 in the morning with a $200,000 envelope and mentioned Emma's walking route with the calm of someone reading a weather report. "Good," Logan said. He did not dress this up. He did not add context or qualifications. The word stood alone and meant exactly what it meant. He called Rachel that night to tell her the situation had moved forward significantly and that Emma could come home by the weekend. Rachel said she had to practically pry Emma away from her kids at this point, which was both reassuring and slightly funny, and Logan sat on the edge of his bed and let himself laugh at it, which was the first time he had laughed at anything in what felt like several weeks. Then he lay back on his bed and stared at the ceiling for a while. The case would take time. Arraignment was not trial. Federal prosecutions were long and procedurally complex and subject to the kind of delays and maneuvering that Patricia had already started preparing him for. Damien's defense team was expensive and experienced and would file motions and seek delays and construct whatever narrative they could around the complexity of financial structures that most jurors would find difficult to follow. But Gerald Fitch had 46 exhibits and would have more. And Stefan Voss had a $40,000 consulting agreement that was either a betrayal of his own interests or evidence of coercion, either of which pointed in the same direction. And Logan had a legal pad with 17 lines of handwriting describing a Monday morning in a parking lot, and Emma's school was named in those 17 lines, and that was the kind of detail that does not translate ambiguously to a jury. The news cycle ran hard for 3 days. Logan ignored most of it. He saw one article that described Hale Capital as rattled and Victoria as fighting to stabilize the company amid questions about oversight. And he turned the page on that one because the framing made him tired in a specific way. He did see one interview, a brief clip, 2 minutes, Victoria outside the Hale Capital building on a Thursday morning in the gray October light. She was wearing a dark coat and she was not smiling, and she spoke without notes. A reporter asked her whether she had any message for the people who had helped expose what had happened. Victoria looked directly at the camera. "There's someone who looked at something that nobody else was paying attention to," she said, "and decided it mattered, at personal cost. I hope that person knows that what they did was meaningful beyond the financial numbers." She did not use Logan's name. She had specifically not used his name, he understood, both for his protection and because naming him would have made it a different kind of story than she wanted it to be. He watched the clip once, alone in the garage office after closing, and then put his phone down and sat with it for a while. The sentencing, which was still many months away, as Patricia had prepared him for, would be the formal end of the legal chapter. But the real turn had already happened, had been happening since the moment Logan had stood at the rear of a Porsche in a Greenwich garage and felt the involuntary stillness of genuine recognition. That moment had been the first domino. Everything else, the meetings, the documents, the injunction, the arrest, the federal charges, the men in suits with search warrants, had been the sequence of everything else falling. One man, one morning, looking at something closely enough to see what it actually was. He picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway and went to lock up the garage. The next morning, he drove to Greenwich to work on the Porsche. He had 11 more days of restoration work ahead of him. The correct replacement parts had been arriving in stages, sourced through the network of specialists, authenticated against the documentation that Hans Brecker's original records supported. The work required the particular combination of patience and precision that he had spent most of his adult life developing, and it was the kind of work that asked nothing of him except his full attention. which was sometimes the best possible thing a task could do. He worked in the climate-controlled garage with the proper lighting, radio off, the way he preferred. He worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and at some point Victoria came in. Not in business clothes this time, just jeans and a dark sweater, her hair loose, and sat on the milk crate in the corner. He noticed. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything either, for a while. "Helen saved my board seat," she said eventually. Logan looked up from the engine bay. "Good," he said. "It wasn't guaranteed," Victoria said. "There were 2 board members who wanted a management review. Helen's memo did what it was supposed to do, but there was a meeting last night that got—" She made a brief, tired gesture. "It was long." "You kept your job," Logan said. "I kept my job," she agreed, "which means now I have to actually do my job. In a company that's been in the news for a week for the wrong reasons, with a co-founder in federal custody and $7 million in documented losses, and every client wondering if their money is safe." "Is it?" "The core portfolios were not touched," she said. "Damien was careful about that. He stole from the operational accounts, from the company's own capital, not from client funds, which is either evidence of a line he wouldn't cross or evidence that touching client funds would have triggered oversight mechanisms he couldn't avoid. Gerald thinks the latter." "Gerald's probably right," Logan said. "Gerald's always right, apparently." She said it with something approaching humor. "He's terrifying, actually. Have you noticed he almost never blinks?" Logan had noticed. "Victoria," he said, setting down his tool. He leaned against the workbench and looked at her directly. "I need to ask you something." "All right." "Damien's trial. When it comes to that, Patricia has already told me I'll likely be called to testify. About the car, the authentication, possibly about the Monday morning in my parking lot." He paused. "I'll do it. I want to be clear that I'll do it, but I want to ask about Emma." Victoria's expression shifted immediately into something more serious. "What do you need?" she said. "I don't know yet what the exposure looks like," Logan said. "The witness intimidation charge protects her to some degree. It's part of the prosecution, not just background. But she's 7 and her name is in federal documents now, and I want to understand what that means practically going forward. I will personally retain whatever security and legal support is needed for Emma's protection throughout this process," Victoria said. "Not as an offer, as a statement of fact. That is not negotiable for me. Whatever it costs, whatever form it takes. You protected this company, Logan, at your own risk. The least I can do is protect your daughter while you see it through." He looked at her. He was not a person who accepted things easily. Help, generosity, the kind of straightforward offer that didn't have a complicated angle attached to it. He had built his adult life around self-sufficiency, partly by choice and partly by circumstance. And the habits of self-sufficiency are hard to set down even when setting them down is the right thing to do. But this was the right thing to do. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. "Don't thank me. Just finish the car." He almost smiled at that. He turned back to the engine. They worked in comfortable silence, her with her phone and whatever she was reading, him with the Porsche and its slowly returning authenticity, until the light through the garage windows changed and the afternoon moved toward evening. Before he left, he walked around the car one final time and took a photograph of the engine bay on his phone. Not for evidence. For himself. The work was approximately 70% complete. Hans Brecker's intake modification was visible and correctly positioned now, surrounded by the right components, everything where it was supposed to be. He sent the photograph to no one. He just looked at it for a moment in his truck before he drove home. The car that had started this, that had, in retrospect, been the hinge point around which everything rotated, was slowly becoming what it had always actually been, underneath the damage. Correct and authentic and real. He thought that was worth something. He thought it was worth quite a lot. He drove back to Stamford in the dark, and the highway was quiet, and he thought about Emma coming home on Saturday, and the cold coffee that would be on his counter, and Marcus's ongoing low-grade war with an electrical fault that refused to yield. The ordinary machinery of his life, waiting patiently for him to come back to it. He was almost there. Emma came home on a Saturday. Logan picked her up from Rachel's in the late morning, and Emma climbed into the truck with the energy of someone returning from a successful expedition, full of stories about her cousin's new hamster and a movie they'd watched twice, and the specific injustice of losing a board game that she had been winning until the very end. She talked for most of the drive back to Stamford, and Logan listened and made the right sounds and felt something in his chest unclench slowly, like a fist that had been closed for weeks. Back at the apartment, Emma dropped her bag in the hallway and immediately went to check that everything was where she had left it. Her books, her wooden toy car on the kitchen windowsill, the drawing she'd taped to the refrigerator of a car with flames coming out of the exhaust, which she had made for Logan's birthday in August, and he had not taken down. Everything was where she'd left it. She seemed satisfied by this, the way children are satisfied by the confirmation that the world maintained itself in their absence. They made lunch together, grilled cheese, which was Emma's current strong preference, and tomato soup from a can, which Logan made slightly better by adding things the can instructions did not suggest. It was an ordinary Saturday lunch in an ordinary kitchen, and Logan was aware of its ordinariness in a way he usually wasn't, the way you notice the temperature of a room only after you've been outside in the cold. "Dad," Emma said, pulling a string of cheese from her sandwich with deliberate care. "Yeah." "Is the car finished?" "Almost," he said. "Few more days." She considered this. "Will you take me to see it when it's done?" Logan looked at her across the kitchen table. He thought about a climate-controlled garage in Greenwich and a guard's red Porsche that was nearly, finally, fully itself again. He thought about whether that was the right place to take a 7-year-old and whether Victoria would mind and whether Emma would be bored or interested, and then he thought, she asked. She wants to see the thing her father has been working on through all of this. That question deserves a yes. "Yeah," he said. "I'll take you to see it." Emma nodded and went back to her sandwich, satisfied. The final days of this Porsche restoration were the most demanding of the whole project, not because the work was technically beyond Logan, but because the final 10% of any authentic restoration is where precision becomes something closer to art. The replacement components he had sourced, a correct specification carburetor from a private collector in Bavaria, ignition and fuel parts authenticated through a documentation chain he had built carefully over 3 weeks, suspension components verified against factory records from 1973, all had to be integrated with the kind of care that left no trace of intervention. The goal was a car that had been returned to itself, not a car that looked like it had been repaired. There is a difference, and only certain people can feel it. He worked on those final days with his full attention, which is not the same as working quickly. He moved through the engine bay and the suspension and the drivetrain with the deliberate pace of someone who has accepted that this particular task cannot be rushed without being ruined. The radio was off. His phone was face down. The light in the garage was correct and constant. On the 4th day, he torqued the last fastener on the reinstalled carburetor and sat back and looked at the engine for a long time without doing anything. Hans Brecker's intake modification sat at the center of everything, as it had always sat, as it had sat before someone tried to bury it under the wrong parts. The porting work was exactly as Logan remembered it, slightly irregular in the way that handwork always is, carrying the specific asymmetries of a specific pair of hands on a specific afternoon in a Stuttgart workshop more than 20 years ago. Logan put his hand near it, not on it, just near it, and held it there for a moment. He was not a sentimental man by deliberate self-construction. He had learned in the years after Claire died that sentiment without structure becomes a weight that doesn't move you forward. He had built his life on forward movement, on the next repair, the next morning, the next school drop-off, the next problem that had a solution if you looked at it carefully enough. But this was a thing that had happened. A man he had respected, who had been harder on him than anyone before or since, who had never once offered false praise, who had taught him that the difference between adequate work and excellent work was not talent but attention, had left his mark on a piece of metal in 1973, and that mark had survived everything, decades, distance, the death of the man who made it, the deliberate attempt to hide it under fraud. And Logan had found it, had recognized it, had protected it. He thought there was something in that worth holding briefly, even for a person who preferred to keep moving. Then he stood up, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and took the final set of photographs. He texted Patricia, "Car is done. Authentication complete. I'll have a full report to you by end of week." She replied within 2 minutes, "Gerald is going to want to review the parts documentation." And Logan, "Well done." He looked at those 2 words for a moment longer than was probably warranted. Then he put his phone away and began cleaning the garage. Victoria arrived an hour later. She came through the side door in the dark coat she seemed to wear most days now, November having arrived with genuine conviction. She stopped just inside the door and looked at the Porsche for a long moment without speaking. The car was, objectively, extraordinary. Guards red in a shade that seemed to generate its own light in the garage's illumination, the chrome correct and bright, the profile of the 911 body doing what it had been doing for 50 years, making everyone who looked at it understand, at some level below language, why people spend their lives caring about these things. But what Logan watched on Victoria's face was not the response to the car's beauty. It was something more complicated and more personal. The look of someone seeing a thing restored that they had believed, for a while, might be permanently broken. She started. Stopped. It's done, Logan said simply. She walked toward it slowly. She ran her hand along the driver's door, not quite pressing, just contact. She looked through the window at the interior. She walked around the rear and looked at the engine bay, which Logan had left open for her. Can you tell? She asked, looking at the engine. I mean, can you see what was changed, what was put back? If you know what you're looking for, Logan said. But the authentication will hold now. The components are correct, the documentation chain is clean, and I've written a full provenance report that covers every part source and verification step. If anyone examines this car, they'll find exactly what they're supposed to find. Victoria turned away from the engine and looked at him. What's it worth now? She asked. Authenticated with the restored provenance? You're probably looking at $550,000 to $600,000 at the right auction. He paused. Maybe more. The Hans Brecker modification is documented now. I've written it up as part of the provenance, with the historical context. That's a piece of Porsche history that most collectors didn't know existed. Victoria made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else. So it's worth more than I paid for it, she said. Yes, because of what someone tried to do to it. Because of what didn't work, Logan said. She stood there for another moment with the quiet that had become, over the past 2 months, something he recognized and was comfortable inside. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her coat and took out an envelope. Logan looked at it. I'm not taking $200,000, he said. It's not $200,000, Victoria said, and her mouth did a small specific thing that he had learned to read as her version of a smile when she didn't quite feel like smiling. It's a check for the agreed restoration cost plus 30%, which is what any competent attorney would tell you to bill for a project of this complexity and urgency. She set the envelope on the workbench. It is also not negotiable. He left the envelope on the workbench. There's something else, Victoria said. She reached into her bag, a different bag than the one she usually carried, softer, less structured, and took out something that stopped Logan's breath briefly. It was a notebook. Leather-bound, well-worn, the kind of notebook that has been handled regularly over many years. The cover was dark brown and had the particular patina of something that lived in someone's hands. After Damien's arrest, Victoria said, the federal investigators released several items from his office that had been flagged as potentially belonging to the company rather than to him personally. Among them was a file of documents related to the Porsche acquisition. She held the notebook out. This was inside that file. It's not a company document. I don't know how Damien came to have it, possibly through the Swiss contact who sold him the car, possibly through someone else in the authentication chain, but I know it belongs to you. Bullshit. Logan took the notebook. He knew what it was before he opened it. The weight of it. The smell of the leather, which is a specific thing that stays in the memory. He opened it. Hans Brecker's handwriting filled the first page. German, compressed. The letters formed with the efficiency of someone who wrote to record rather than to be read. Below the first page of technical notes, on the second page was a list of names. Under the list of names, annotations. Brief, evaluative, the way a teacher annotates a gradebook. Not grades exactly, more like characterizations. Logan's name was there, near the middle of the list. The annotation beside it was 7 words in German. He read them slowly, his German being functional rather than fluent, but sufficient for this. Sieht, was andere nicht sehen wollen, sees what others do not want to see. He stood in the garage with the notebook open and read those 7 words 3 times. The garage was very quiet. The Porsche sat red and completed under the correct light. He closed the notebook. "Thank you," he said. His voice was even. "He made sure of that." "He knew you," Victoria said quietly. "Whatever you think you are now, whoever you've decided you are after everything that happened, he knew what you were when you were 23 years old, and he wrote it down." Logan put the notebook carefully on the workbench beside the envelope. "Do you want to start it?" he asked. Victoria blinked. "The car?" "It's been running wrong since you bought it," Logan said. "I'd like you to hear what it actually sounds like." She looked at him for a moment, then looked at the Porsche, then back at him. Something shifted in her expression. The professional composure that she wore like a second coat, loosening slightly around the edges. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." He handed her the key. She opened the driver's door and got in, and Logan stood a few feet back and she turned the key, and the 1973 Porsche 911S started. The engine note that filled the garage was, "There is no way to describe this adequately to someone who has not been in a room with a correctly running vintage air-cooled flat six. It is not loud in the way of modern performance. It is precise and textured and deeply, specifically itself, a sound that was engineered in a particular decade with a particular philosophy about what an engine should communicate to the person it belongs to." Victoria sat in the car with both hands on the wheel and the engine running and said nothing. Logan watched her face through the windshield. He saw the moment it landed, the moment the sound of the car moved past the intellectual understanding of correctly restored and became something personal, something that belonged to her. Her shoulders came down about a half-inch. Her hands, which had been tight on the wheel, relaxed. She sat there for maybe 3 minutes with the engine running. Then she turned it off, and the garage went quiet, and she got out. She did not say anything immediately, and he did not require her to. "Same time next week," she finally said. "Bring Emma." He almost asked if she was sure and then didn't because she was clearly sure. The federal case against Damian Cross moved through the winter with the particular rhythm of federal prosecutions: deliberate, procedural, occasionally dramatic, mostly not. Logan testified twice in preliminary proceedings and once in a deposition, all managed through Patricia, all focused on the mechanical evidence and the Monday morning encounter in his parking lot. The deposition was the hardest of the three. Damian's defense team was led by a partner from a white shoe firm named Bradfield, who had the particular skill of making straightforward things sound complicated. He spent 40 minutes trying to establish that Logan's identification of Hans Brecker's intake modification was subjective, that Logan had no formal credentials as an authentication expert, and that the replacement components could have been installed by a previous owner rather than at Damian's direction. Logan answered every question the same way he diagnosed engines: patiently, specifically, without embellishment or defensiveness. "You claim to have recognized a specific modification as the work of a specific individual," Bradfield said, "based on memory from a period over a decade ago." "Based on direct observation," Logan said. I watched Hans Brecker perform that modification. I have photographs of the modification as I found it in the Hale vehicle, compared against technical descriptions in the notebook that is now in evidence. The match is not a matter of memory, it's a matter of documentation." Bradfield pivoted. "Mr. Carter, you have no formal degree in mechanical engineering, no certification from any recognized authentication body. No, I have 15 years of experience working on European performance vehicles," Logan said, "including 6 months working directly beside one of the most technically respected Porsche engineers of the late 20th century. My identification of his work has been supported by 3 independent vintage Porsche specialists who reviewed my documentation and concurred." He paused. "I understand you need to challenge my qualifications. I'm telling you what they are." Patricia, seated beside him, did not visibly react, but he caught, from the corner of his eye, the faint adjustment of her posture that he had learned to read as her version of satisfaction. Stefan Voss, in the end, cooperated with federal investigators. His attorney negotiated a plea agreement in exchange for detailed testimony about his involvement. The $40,000 payment, the specific instructions he'd received about which components to replace, the documentation he'd been given about the car's authentication history that told him exactly which parts would affect the authentication outcome. He had not known, his attorney maintained, the full scope of what Damian Cross was doing. He had understood the Porsche job as a private arrangement to devalue a car for insurance purposes. Shady, clearly illegal, but not connected in his mind to a $7 million fraud operation. Logan found this believable. Not exculpatory, but believable. Voss's testimony corroborated everything Gerald had built from the financial side and everything Logan had built from the mechanical side. It described Damian Cross as a man who compartmentalized information with precision, who gave each collaborator exactly as much as they needed and no more, who had been operating on the assumption that the compartments would never connect. They had connected in a Greenwich garage on a September morning when Logan Carter opened an engine bay and went still. The trial itself ran for 11 days in February in a federal courtroom in New Haven. Logan attended 3 of those days, the 2 on which he testified and the day the verdict was delivered, because Patricia had said he should be there and because he agreed with her. The courtroom was smaller than television had led him to expect. The jury was 12 people who looked like the cross-section of any random Connecticut afternoon, a retired teacher, 2 people who appeared to be in their 30s and worked in something professional, an older man with reading glasses he pushed up constantly. Ordinary people doing a civic thing they had not asked to do, listening carefully to complicated evidence about shell companies and wire transfers and a vintage car. Logan sat in the gallery on the verdict day beside Patricia, who was in her best suit and had her legal pad out even though there was nothing to write. Damian Cross sat at the defense table in a suit that was less expensive than the ones Logan had seen him in. He had lost some of the silver-templed composure of his website photograph. He looked like a man who had been inside a confined situation for 4 months and had not quite adjusted to what that meant for the version of himself he had always presented to the world. The jury returned after a day and a half of deliberation, guilty on all counts: wire fraud, corporate theft, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation. The room was quiet for a moment after the verdict was read, that particular silence of something large and anticipated finally landing. Then it became not quiet, the murmur of the gallery and the movement of the legal teams and the judge's instructions about sentencing scheduling. Damian Cross turned once toward the gallery. Logan did not know if the look was directed at him specifically or at the room in general. Damian's face had a quality that was impossible to read cleanly. Not quite shock, not quite anger, not quite the resignation you might expect. More like the expression of a man who has run a complex calculation and arrived at a result he still does not fully accept. Logan held the look steadily and without expression for the 2 seconds it lasted. Then Damian was turning back toward his attorneys, and it was over. Outside the courthouse, in the February cold, Patricia grabbed Logan's arm briefly. Not a hug, just contact, brief and real. 12 counts, she said. All 12. Yeah, Logan said. Gerald is buying dinner, she said. All of us. Tonight. I've got Emma. Bring Emma, Patricia said. Gerald loves kids. You wouldn't know it from looking at him, but he does. Logan thought about Gerald Fitch, the short, quiet man with the canvas briefcase and the reading glasses and the 46 exhibits, sitting in a restaurant with a 7-year-old who had strong opinions about most things. Okay, he said. It was a good dinner. Gerald did in fact love kids. He and Emma had an extended conversation about the structural engineering of a hamster cage that Logan could not follow, but Emma clearly found fascinating. Patricia drank wine and told a story about a deposition in 2019 that had gone badly wrong in a way that was, in retrospect, very funny, and Gerald laughed at it with his whole face in a way that you wouldn't have predicted. Logan ate his food and watched the table and felt, for the first time in months, the particular ease of being somewhere without an agenda. No next step, no documents to review, no calculation of risk, just a table of people who had done something together and were marking it the way ordinary people mark things, with food and noise and the specific warmth of shared history. Emma fell asleep on the drive home, one cheek against the window, her coat bunched under her head as a pillow. He carried her up to the apartment, which he had been able to do for approximately 1 more year before it would stop being physically practical, a fact he was aware of and was not ready to think about too directly. He got her to bed without waking her. He hung up her coat and put her shoes by the door. He stood in her doorway for a moment in the dark. He had been afraid for her this fall, not constantly, not in a way that had paralyzed him, but the fear had been real and present. The cold knowledge of her specific vulnerability, her walking route, the dogs on the fence at Chester and 3rd. He had moved her, protected her, arranged what protection he could, and it had been enough. But the fear had been there. He thought about that now, standing in her doorway. The fear was not a weakness. It was the accurate measurement of what she meant to him, the instrument that registers what is actually at stake. He had spent too many years after Claire died trying to minimize what things meant to him because meaning had proven dangerous, had made loss catastrophic, had nearly broken something in him that he'd needed intact to function as a father and a person. He had been learning, slowly and with regular setbacks, that meaning is not the problem. The problem is believing that meaning makes you fragile. Emma was the evidence against that belief. She was the thing that mattered most and also, somehow, the source of whatever it was that had made him stand in a parking lot on a Monday morning and say no to $200,000 and a man who was pointing at her. He pulled her door almost closed and went to the kitchen and made coffee even though it was 10 o'clock. He sat at the table with the notebook in front of him. He had been carrying it since the garage, in his bag, then in the truck, then into the apartment. He hadn't opened it again since that afternoon with Victoria. He opened it now. Hans Brecker's handwriting filled page after page. Technical observations, measurements, small sketches of mechanical components. The occasional impatient note in the margin that Logan could almost hear in the man's voice. He read through slowly, translating roughly as he went, not trying to capture everything, but just moving through the record of a mind that had paid careful attention to things for most of a long life. He found his own name twice, once in the list with the 7-word annotation, once in a later entry, a brief paragraph about a specific diagnosis Logan had performed during his months in Stuttgart, a fuel system fault on a 1971 Carrera that 3 more experienced mechanics had misread. Hans had written about it with the flatness of a medical record. L. Carter identified the fault correctly, did not announce this, waited to be asked. Unusual quality in a young person, worth noting. Logan sat with that for a while. He had not been exceptional at 23. He had been competent and attentive and willing to be corrected, which is its own kind of unremarkable. What Hans had apparently seen in him was not brilliance, but something more durable. The habit of looking carefully at things, of not needing to perform the looking, of being willing to be wrong and to keep working. He had not done anything spectacular this fall. He had looked at an engine, recognized what he saw, followed what the evidence said, and refused to stop when someone tried to make stopping the easier option. That was all. It was also, he thought, everything. He closed the notebook and drank his coffee and sat in the quiet apartment with the November sounds of the building around him. There was a voicemail he hadn't listened to yet, from a number he didn't recognize, left that afternoon while he was in court. He played it now. It was a woman's voice, professional and warm, identifying herself as the director of a program called the Porsche Heritage Restoration Initiative, a privately funded effort based in Connecticut that worked with museums, collectors, and estate sales to authenticate and restore significant vehicles in the air-cooled Porsche lineage. She had been referred by Victoria Hale, she said. She had reviewed the provenance report Logan had written on the 1973 911S. She would like to discuss a possible collaboration, a standing role as a consulting restorer, working on significant vehicles as they came through the program, with full access to their documentation resources and technical archive. She said it was not a full-time position. It was structured to allow him to keep his shop, his existing work, his existing life. She ended by saying, quietly, "We've been looking for someone with your specific set of skills for a long time, Mr. Carter. We hope you'll be interested." Logan played it twice. Then he sat with his coffee and looked at the wall above the refrigerator where Emma's birthday drawing was still taped. The car with the flames from the exhaust, the letters slightly uneven, the signature in the bottom corner that said Emma, age 7, which she had added with the gravity of an artist signing a canvas. He thought about what it meant to be found at 32, sitting in a garage in Stamford that nobody had ever heard of, doing work that most people didn't understand was skilled. He thought about the version of himself he had arrived at through a series of losses and adjustments and quiet mornings, and the unspectacular discipline of showing up and doing the work correctly. He had not been building toward anything, exactly. He had been maintaining, keeping himself and Emma intact, keeping the garage open, keeping the quality of the work honest. And then one phone call from a tired woman in Greenwich had moved the whole structure of it, revealed something underneath the ordinary surface of his days that had been there all along. The specific value of a person who looks closely when looking closely is hard. That was not romantic. It was not a transformation. He was the same person he had been in August, before any of this. His garage still needed a new sign. His truck still had a rattle in the right door panel that he kept meaning to address. Emma still needed clean socks packed when she traveled, but he had done something. He had stood in the place where it was uncomfortable to stand, looked at the thing that was uncomfortable to look at, and refused to look away when the cost of looking became personal. He called the number back the next morning. The director of the Heritage Initiative, her name was Dr. Carla Osman, answered on the second ring, and they talked for 45 minutes. She was knowledgeable in ways Logan found immediately credible and honest about the program's limitations in ways he found more credible still. She talked about the work the way he talked about work, not with the performed passion of someone selling something, but with the specific enthusiasm of someone who has spent a long time inside a subject and finds it genuinely interesting. He asked questions. She asked questions. They disagreed briefly about the correct approach to authenticating a particular generation of 911 components, and neither of them backed down immediately, and both of them arrived, after a few minutes, at a position that was slightly different from where either had started. He said he was interested. She said she was glad. She said they would talk again next week, and he agreed. He hung up and stood in his office for a moment with the phone still in his hand. Marcus appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a natural break in events. "Good call?" Marcus asked. "Yeah," Logan said. "Good call." "The sob is done," Marcus said. "Finally. Completely." The electrical fault was a ground strap that had been installed wrong sometime in the past decade by someone who should not have been near that car. "Did you call Dr. Kimathi?" "He cried a little," Marcus said. "On the phone. I think he loves that car more than most people love other people." Logan looked at his assistant. This person who had covered his schedule and made the right calls and never asked for more than he was told and was going to get a substantial raise in January, which Logan had already decided. "Good work," Logan said. Marcus seemed to understand that this was not only about the sob, but he accepted it at the sob level, which was the right thing to do. He kept his promise to Emma. On a Saturday morning in December, with the first real snow of the season making the roads cautious, Logan drove to Greenwich with Emma in the passenger seat, her boots barely reaching the floor mat, her wooden toy car in her lap because she had insisted on bringing it. Victoria met them at the garage door. She was in jeans and a heavy sweater, and her hair was down, and she shook Emma's hand with genuine seriousness when Logan introduced them, treating her like a person rather than an accessory, which Emma immediately registered and approved of. Emma walked around the Porsche 3 times. She crouched at the front, the way Logan always crouched at the front of cars. She stood on her toes to look over the rear lid into the engine bay. She touched the door handle carefully with both hands, the way she handled Logan's more precise tools. "It's red," she said. "Guard's red," Logan said. Emma absorbed this. "Why is it called Guard's red?" "Because it's the color used for racing cars at the Nürburgring circuit in Germany," Victoria said. "The track marshals, the guards, could spot the cars easily at that color." Emma looked at Victoria with the expression she reserved for information she found genuinely interesting. "That's why it's named that?" "That's the history," Victoria said. Emma looked back at the car. She placed her wooden toy car on the garage floor beside the Porsche, a rough, child-made thing beside a $500,000 masterwork, and crouched down to look at both of them at eye level. The wood grain of the toy, the lacquered red of the 911. She studied the comparison with the serious attention of a person doing real work. Logan watched her from a few feet back. Beside him, Victoria watched too. "She's like you," Victoria said quietly. "How do you mean?" "The way she looks at things," Victoria said. "She's actually looking, not performing looking, actually looking." Logan watched his daughter examine 2 cars at 7 years old on a Saturday morning in December. He thought about Hans Brecker writing 7 words in a notebook. He thought about what it meant to pass something along without knowing you're doing it. The habits of attention, the quality of looking, the willingness to stay with a thing until you understand what it actually is. "Yeah," he said, "she does that." Emma picked up her wooden car and stood and turned and held it out toward Victoria. "You can hold it," Emma said. It won't break. Victoria looked at the small car in Emma's hand. Something moved across her face. Not sentiment, or not only sentiment, but the specific expression of someone receiving something genuine from an unexpected direction. She took the wooden car and held it. They stood in the garage, the three of them, with the snow coming down outside and the Porsche sitting red and correct and restored under its proper light, and nobody said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed to be said. The story doesn't end cleanly. Stories rarely do. The sentencing hearing for Damien Cross came in March, and Logan drove to New Haven in the early morning and sat in the gallery and watched a federal judge sentence a man to 11 years in federal prison, stripped of his professional licenses, his assets frozen pending restitution proceedings that would take years to complete. 11 years. Logan had expected to feel more than he felt. He had expected some clean resolution, the satisfying closure that the end of something significant is supposed to produce. What he felt instead was something quieter and more complicated, closer to tired than triumphant, the feeling of having been in a long situation that required sustained effort and watching it finally stop requiring effort. It was not nothing, but it was not the thing movies make it look like. He drove back to Stamford afterward and opened the garage and worked on a Volkswagen that needed a clutch, and Marcus brought him coffee without being asked, and by noon it was just another Tuesday. Victoria rebuilt. That was the right word. Not recovered, not bounced back, none of the language that minimizes what it took. She rebuilt Hale Capital over 18 months, client by careful client, with Helen Marsh's support, and a transparency that she made structural rather than performative. She did not pretend the year had not happened. She talked about it honestly when asked, in the specific way of someone who has accepted that the experience is now part of her record and has decided to own it rather than minimize it. The company stabilized. It did not return to exactly what it had been. Something had been changed in its architecture, in the way it operated, and the way Victoria operated inside it. The changes were mostly improvements. Some were not. That's the reality of rebuilding. The Heritage Initiative work became a regular part of Logan's weeks. One vehicle every 6 to 8 weeks, on average. Significant cars with complicated histories, provenance questions, authentication challenges. Work that required exactly the combination of skills he had spent his life developing without quite knowing why. He did not move the garage. He did not move the apartment. Emma turned 8 in August and wanted a birthday party with 3 specific friends and a cake that had a car on it, which Logan attempted and which was, by every objective measure, not a good cake in terms of appearance, but which Emma declared to be the best birthday cake she had ever seen, and he suspected she was being generous but accepted it anyway. The wooden toy car that Emma had brought to Greenwich in December sat on the kitchen windowsill, where it always had. On the sill beside it, propped against the frame, was a photograph that Victoria had taken without announcement that day in the garage. Emma crouching to look at both cars at eye level, Logan a few feet back watching her, the red Porsche in the background. Victoria had sent it to him without comment, just the photograph, and he had printed it and put it on the windowsill. He looked at it sometimes. Not every day, just sometimes. He thought about what it showed. His daughter looking at something with her whole attention, the thing itself sitting still and patient and waiting to be seen, and he thought there was something in that image that said what he couldn't quite say directly about the year that had happened. The world has a tendency to route around the people who actually see things. The people who notice what's wrong when noticing is inconvenient, who follow what the evidence says when what the evidence says is complicated, who stand in the spot that other people step away from, not because they're heroes, not because they've calculated the odds and found them favorable, but because not standing there would require them to be someone other than who they are. Those people don't usually end up in photographs. They usually end up back at work on Tuesday with coffee that's gone slightly cold and a car that needs a clutch and a daughter who will need new shoes before the winter is over. Logan Carter drove Emma to the bus stop on a Wednesday morning in September, 1 year to the month since the first call from Greenwich. He watched the yellow bus take the corner the way he always did. He stood until it was gone. Then he went back inside and opened the garage and started his day. The light in the lot still didn't work. He made a note to call the building owner again.